Okay, so it's now 7:30. Hi, Guy. Hi, Gabriella. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Um, to everybody in our audience, welcome to the Canadian Friends of Peace Now webinar. This is the fourth in our new series. My name is Joshua Cox, and I'm a board member of the Canadian Friends of Peace Now, and I will be your host this evening. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Guy Ziv, a U.S. foreign policy expert who focuses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, among many other things. Tonight, Guy will address the topic, looming annexation and the U.S.-Israel relationship. As usual, we will start with an overview presentation from Guy. After that, I'll pose a few questions that have been submitted in advance by many of you and by members of our board, and then we will go to questions from the audience. So what I'd like all of you to do during this webinar is I invite you to write your questions at any time during the webinar into the Q&A function. You'll find the Q&A icon at the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen. When you click on this icon, it will open up a panel and you will be able to write in your question there and I'll be able to collect them. What we're going to try to do is if people are asking similar questions, we'll probably pull together those like questions and just to make sure we get through all of those to pose to Guy tonight. What now, I actually have the pleasure of asking Gabriella Gallagher, the chair of the Canadian Friends of Peace Now, to introduce our guest. Over to you, Gabriella.
Thank you very much, Josh. You hear me okay? All's well? Yeah, okay. It's an honor to introduce Professor Guy Ziv tonight. He has a very distinguished CV, but I'm not going to get into too much detail. I'll focus on the highlights so that we can get to our program as soon as possible. Guy Ziv is an assistant professor in the U.S. Foreign Policy Program at the School of International Service at American University in Washington. He teaches on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and international negotiations. He has been published widely in the American and Israeli media. Professor Ziv has also worked at the U.S. Department of State and for leading nonprofit organizations that promote American involvement in Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. He is the author of the very interesting sounding book, Why Hawks Become Doves, Shimon Peres, and Foreign Policy Change in Israel. Welcome to our webinar, Professor Ziv, and now over to you.
Thank you so much, Josh and Gabriella, for that very nice introduction. And I was actually looking forward to this webinar for no other reason. It's just a nice break from the crazy times that we're all finding ourselves in. So I want to make three major points in today's webinar. The first one is that America's role as an honest broker has been severely compromised by the Trump administration. Secondly, there's been a growing partisan divide in the United States that's only going to accelerate if Israel does opt for annexation. And the third major point is that one of the biggest casualties of this partisan divide will be Israel's relationship with American Jews, its biggest diaspora community. When you look at kind of the arc of U.S. foreign policy in the last 50, 60 years, you'll see that establishing or trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has long been defined as an important U.S. foreign policy objective in the Middle East. And since the 1970s, U.S. administrations have been trying to play the role of an honest broker in the peace process. So that began with Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. Jimmy Carter, of course, brokered the Camp David Accords that led to the first Israeli-Arab peace treaty, the one with Egypt. The Madrid Peace Conference in October of '91 led to the Oslo Accords, which in turn enabled Israel to make peace with Jordan the following year, and that was brokered by Bill Clinton. And so we've seen kind of on again, off again, US mediated peace talks with Republican and Democratic administrations alike. And this support has traditionally been a bipartisan support. In fact, Israel and the topic of Israel in the United States has traditionally been a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue, not a partisan one. And that's really changed, and I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. But first, let's just briefly say what an honest broker is and is not in this context. Does it mean neutrality? No, I don't think anybody has ever argued that the United States has been neutral when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. But does it mean Palestinian buy-in? Yes. Does it mean leverage over Israel in negotiations? Yes. And that's why this role has been so important. And there has been very dramatic changes in the last 3.5 years in the Trump era, that changes that have really undercut America's role as an honest broker. From scrapping the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 to recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, then relocating our embassy there while merging the US consulate and the embassy. The consulate, I should note, has for over 150 years served as the US primary venue for communication with the Palestinians. Last year, the Trump administration recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. There's also been a very significant change in US policy towards the settlements issue. All the previous administrations had, to some extent, been opposed to it. But there's been a change in, not just in tone, but in substance. A change in tone because there's been no public criticism and no real public pressure on the government to halt settlement construction. But last November, the White House declared that the US considered settlements not to be inconsistent with international law. And so this is a real change in US policy. At the same time, there's been punitive measures vis-a-vis the Palestinians. The Trump administration cut more than $200 million in aid to the Palestinians 2 years ago. The administration decided to stop funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the agency that provides assistance to Palestinian refugees. A month or two later, it shut down the PLO office in Washington. And then, of course, we have the deal of the century, the Trump peace plan, which was unveiled at the beginning of this year, where the Palestinians weren't even consulted. And it's a plan that does envision a Palestinian state, but also recognizes Israeli settlements in the West Bank. It allows Israel to keep about 30% of the territory. It would make any future Palestinian state very disjointed. And then there are, of course, plenty of other issues with a Trump plan that the Palestinians object to, including rather than East Jerusalem as the future capital of a Palestinian state, it envisions Abu Dis, which is a suburb of Jerusalem. And it's basically, they're talking about limited sovereignty, not full sovereignty, as we think of when we talk about the quote unquote two-state solution. And so therefore, the Palestinians don't accept Trump as an honest broker. They've lost whatever little faith they've had in the peace process. And there haven't really been any contacts, at least formally or officially, with the White House in several years. And that's very dangerous. So the big question is the Netanyahu government going to begin annexation on July 1st? And that's what we're all waiting to see. And it's really up to Netanyahu, and of course also up to the Trump administration. He needs a green light from the Trump administration to do so. And there are kind of two schools of thought here. One school of thought says Netanyahu understands that there are very severe consequences, very serious consequences, and he's not really planning to go ahead with it. And from what I understand, your group has had several webinars and events dealing with annexation. I just want to quickly sum up the major consequences of annexation. Relations with Arab countries, especially Jordan, would take a big hit. The international community would impose it, seeing it as a violation of international law. It would harm the Israeli economy because of likely EU sanctions. It would harm Israel diaspora relations. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes because that directly relates to my talk. It could even destabilize Jordan. It could also destabilize or destroy the PA, the Palestinian Authority. And it would also kill the two-state solution and could lead to an apartheid-like state. So these are very, very negative consequences. And not surprisingly, the security community in Israel very much opposes annexation. Just to quote former Shin Bet chief Yoram Cohen, who is a Netanyahu appointee, he asks kind of rhetorically, who's going to protect us when we count our dead? And we've seen one former security official after another talk about the dangers of annexation. And so the other kind of question people ask in this school of thought that says that Netanyahu is not going to do it, if you were really interested in doing it, why has he not done so? I mean, he's been in power for many years. He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. This is his 11th year in power consecutively. He was prime minister the first time in the 90s. So why has he not gone for it in the past? The other school of thought says that maybe Netanyahu has concluded that this could be his legacy and that this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You've got a friendly administration, friendly in terms of as far as the settlers are concerned. And if it's going to happen, it has to happen now. We don't know what's going to happen in November. If Biden is in office, they're not going to receive the same kind of support. So if annexation is going to happen, it has to happen in the next few months. That's kind of the school of thought that says that Netanyahu is going to go for it. And from the White House itself, we've seen mixed signals. You have the camp led by Ambassador David Friedman, who's a strong supporter of the settlements. He is fervently in support of annexation, a champion of the settlers and the settlements. And then you have the Jared Kushner camp, which is less devoted to that idea, is more cautious. And I think that Jared Kushner has increasingly come to realize that this is a very complicated matter, and therefore he has tried to slow things down. So one question we might want to ask is, why now? What explains the sudden push for annexation? We haven't had a peace process in several years. What's the rush? Why now? Why is the Trump administration talking about it? Why is the Netanyahu government talking about it? And at the end of the day, it really boils down to domestic politics. So for Israel, for Netanyahu, we're dealing with a settler lobby, which is a very important part of his base. He needed them to win re-election, and he needs them today if he wants to stay in power. In the United States, Trump relies very much on the evangelical community. And that's a very important part of Trump's base and critical to his re-election. And to a lesser extent, you have billionaire donors like Sheldon Adelson, who also support these ideas. So we're really talking about domestic politics over national security considerations for both Israel and the United States. But if Israel does go ahead with annexation, it's going to test U.S.-Israel relations like never before. So just to put all of this in context, let's take a look at some troubling trends in U.S.-Israel relations in recent years. So while most Americans generally hold a positive view of Israel, we've seen a steady erosion in the number of Americans who describe Israel as an ally. And so these are figures that I've taken from the Economist and YouGov polls. They do these annual polls. 5 years ago, 2015, 47% of Americans described Israel as an ally. And over the years, that's gone down, and today it's 37, 38%. We've seen a gender gap in these polls as well. 46% of men describe Israel as an ally, but only 30% of women see Israel as an ally. And there's an age gap. About 30% of 18 to 28-year-olds see Israel as an ally, compared to 52% of those over 65. And so we're really seeing younger Americans, including young American Jews, who are drifting away from Israel. And it's largely a partisan divide. Majorities in both parties have favorable views of the Israeli people, but Republicans are more likely than Democrats to have a favorable view. And the Pew Institute does annual polls as well, and they've found a steady increase in the gap a widening gap between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to support for Israel or support for the Palestinians, for that matter, as well. And I would add that Netanyahu has played a very important role in this growing partisan divide. He and his ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, have openly sided with Republicans over Democrats. Netanyahu clashed with Bill Clinton. A lot of people forget that. Of course, everyone knows he clashed with President Obama. He all but endorsed Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential elections, invited him to Israel in the midst of the presidential campaign. And then, and perhaps most importantly, in 2015, he addressed a joint session of Congress in an effort to undercut the Iran nuclear deal, which was Obama's signature foreign policy achievement. And at the same time, we're seeing a growing rift between American Jews and Israelis. And Exhibit A was the reaction to the Pittsburgh Synagogue massacre in October of 2018, when then Israeli Minister of Diaspora Naftali Bennett tweeted that he was flying to Pittsburgh to be with our sisters and brothers in their darkest hour. David Simon, the creator of The Wire, tweeted back, "Go home. Netanyahu's interventions in US politics aided in the election of Donald Trump and his raw and relentless validation of white nationalism and fascism. The American Jewish community is now bleeding at the hands of the Israeli prime minister, and many of us know it." And there was a progressive group in Pittsburgh that told President Trump that he wasn't welcome in Pittsburgh until he denounces white nationalism. So we're really seeing contrasting political orientations. Most Israelis identify as conservative, while most American Jews identify as liberal. And that's something that's only grown in recent years. The Melman Group did a survey a couple years ago showing that while most American Jews support Israel, they don't support Israeli policies. And the vast majority of American Jews identify as not only Democrats, but as liberal Democrats. And most of them, of course, voted for Hillary Clinton. Contrast that to Israelis, most of whom see themselves as conservative. The left is very small in Israel. Most American Jews don't even vote on Israel, as J Street polls have shown. And for most American Jews, the biggest priorities are healthcare and gun violence, Social Security, Medicare, the economy, immigration, other issues aside from Israel. They don't necessarily vote on Israel. And that might be different for Orthodox Jews, which is a minority in the United States. And we're also, of course, seeing a pronounced age gap when it comes to American Jews. Most young Americans are liberal. They have been inculcated with liberal values at home, in their synagogues, at their schools. I see it at the university all the time, and in Jewish summer camps. Whereas in Israel, the vast majority of young Israelis define themselves as right-wing. Very few, very small percentage define themselves as liberal or left. And they also have, of course, not surprisingly, contrasting views on the Trump administration. Trump is generally popular in Israel. He's seen as a friend who has their back. There was no love lost for Obama. The opposite is the case among American Jews who very much liked Obama and really dislike President Trump. When we look at the key issues of divergence, we see, number one, American Jews and Americans in general very uncomfortable with Netanyahu's embrace of ultra-nationalists like Orban and Brazil's Bolsonaro, and the slew of illiberal legislation. And even if most Americans are not aware of all these bills, you had the Muazzin bill, the Nakba law, a couple of BDS blacklist and boycott laws, they've heard about some of them. They've heard, for example, about the nation state bill, which removes Arabic as an official state language, and some say also, relegates the Arabs to kind of official second-class citizenship, where there's not even a mention of equality or minority rights. And these are bills that we've seen in recent years, some of which have the support of Netanyahu and had the support of his previous governments. We'll see if his new government supports this legislation. Another issue that's very touchy to American Jews is the issue of religious pluralism. And in 2017, the Israeli government scrapped a compromise that was reached after many months, years even, of painstaking negotiations with the American Jewish leaders to expand the non-Orthodox prayer section at the Western Wall. And Netanyahu blamed this on the ultra-Orthodox coalition partners. He said he didn't have a choice. And so we're seeing kind of this increasing acceptance in Israel among the right of the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbinate that's been given more and more power over issues like Jewish conversion, and that's a problem for a lot of American Jews. And finally, we're seeing Israeli government policies towards the Palestinians that haven't sat well with American Jews either, because in the past, again, even for American Jews who don't necessarily follow these issues very closely, they knew that the leaders in Israel were at least making an effort to negotiate earnestly with the Palestinian counterparts. They saw Rabin and they saw Ehud Barak, and even Sharon disengaged from the Gaza Strip, and Olmert gave a very far-reaching offer to Abbas. But with Netanyahu, it's very hard to make that argument that there's been a real effort, an earnest effort to negotiate peace, despite Netanyahu's pledge in June 2019. In June 2009 to support a two-state solution, and that was obviously done because he was pressured to do so by President Obama. So it'll be very interesting to see if annexation is going to actually take place. If it does, it's going to surely damage the U.S.-Israel relationship in the immediate sense. If Biden is elected in November, he already made it clear that he is not going to give a green light or it will not get any kind of recognition for his administration, from his administration. He said the other day that annexation would choke off any hope for peace. And simply put, Americans are not going to accept apartheid. So this is something that is simply not going to sit well here in the United States. And we've seen in the last year increasing calls from progressives to condition foreign aid to Israel. This was a demand made by Bernie Sanders that Biden has rejected, but inevitably we're likely to see this happen at some point. Even short of BDS, and this is not really about BDS, there may be more and more efforts by progressives to pressure their members of Congress to support this kind of legislation. And this will definitely accelerate if Israel annexes the territories. So the last thing I want to say is that sufficient pressure can stop it. It is not too late. There have been indications in recent days that the Trump administration itself wants to slow the process of annexation. So it looks like they're getting cold feet. And Israeli support for annexation, I should note, is underwhelming. We've seen a couple of contradictory polls, some showing 50% of Israelis supporting annexation, others showing much less than 50%. And even the one that was published earlier this week showing that 50% of Jewish Israelis support annexation, that number drops to 25% if the move isn't done with American support. So it's a very kind of shallow support for annexation. There hasn't been a real debate in Israel over annexation for a while. Most people don't really understand the difference between, say, applying sovereignty or annexation. They don't realize it's the same thing. So when you word a poll one way, you're going to get one set of results. You word it in another way, you get another set of results. And so I think the pressure can stop this from happening. And then, of course, the real question is, if Biden is elected in November, is he going to pursue a two-state solution? Because we know that every successful Arab-Israeli agreement to date has had the U.S. support and has had U.S. mediation. It's no guarantee that U.S. mediation is going to lead to a deal, but without it, we can be virtually assured that there won't be one. And so that's I want to leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer your questions tonight.
Well, Guy, that was a truly incredible introduction. I think you've definitely shown your chops as a foreign policy expert, and I couldn't be more glad to have you on today. You covered a lot of ground there, and I think there's a bunch of different things that we're going to want to try to unpack for our audience. Just for our audience now, I can already see that many of you have started inputting your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom. I'll just take this opportunity again to remind all of you where that is. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A function. Please feel free to click on that and type in any questions you have for Guy that you would like me to ask tonight. Like I said, I'm going to try to pull together a couple different light questions and ask those. Okay, why don't we get into some of the things that you talked about? You mentioned several times that you don't believe that this is a done deal. We can kind of talk about how you feel about how done of a deal you think this is. But why don't we start with some of the things that, whether it's within Israel itself or whether it's within the United States or other actors, Canada being one of those, EU, etc., the Palestinians, Jordan, what are the variables that could actually influence this to not take place, for annexation to not occur?
In one word, pressure.
Yeah.
And but just to elaborate, pressure from the United States is very different than pressure from, say, the EU, where Israel is kind of used to international condemnations in the UN and from the EU, and they don't take them very seriously. The United States is a different story, and I think that the Israelis do not take the United States for granted. At least those in power don't take the United States for granted. I think most Israelis don't. And so when they start to understand that this is not going to go over very well here, I think that they have second thoughts. And when I say they, I'm referring specifically to Netanyahu and his camp. I'm not talking about the opposition. I'm not talking about the left. I'm not talking about those who oppose annexation. I'm talking about those who are talking about pursuing it. And Netanyahu is a very cautious political player who is very attuned to pressures, domestic pressures primarily in recent years. But he is not going to mess around with this if the Trump administration says not so fast, if he understands that Biden has a realistic shot at getting elected and Biden has not minced words on this. So I think pressure is the key here to preventing this.
So, okay. So let's talk about Biden for just a minute. Does he need to say more than he has already said? I mean, I have, whether it's through social media or through the news, there are many different groups that are attempting to pressure him to make a more forceful stance so that a Netanyahu or his team actually understands that this is real. Should Biden be elected, Biden will actually take these certain motions. Do you believe that he's said enough regarding this?
I think that so far, based on a conversation that he had with his donors, his American Jewish donors, that was publicized earlier this week or last week, I believe it was last week. I think he made it pretty clear. I think he was pretty explicit. Don't forget, there are probably a lot of back channels and private conversations that he's having as well. And we also saw a visit recently that was a very interesting visit by Pompeo. He was there in Israel for less than 24 hours. And he didn't seem overly enthusiastic about annexation either. And there's a lot of speculation as to why was he really there? Why did he go to Israel for less than 24 hours? Was it about this? Was it about China? Was it about Iran? We don't know. But we do know that he didn't express the sort of enthusiasm that some in Netanyahu's camp were hoping he would express. We also know that the other day Netanyahu had a pretty contentious meeting with the leaders of the settlement movement in Israel. And these are based on conversations Netanyahu had with the Americans. And that might mean Trump administration officials, but it also might mean Biden people. And he was very coy about what it is he intended to do. And it left a lot of the settler leaders who attended this meeting very uncomfortable.
So I'm going to try to slide in a little bit of Canadian content here, Guy, if you'll allow me. And I know that you're not a Canadian Israel foreign policy expert, but what is your opinion on I know you mentioned the EU. What is your opinion on pressure from Canada, whether it's Canadian diplomats, Canadian former diplomats, the current Canadian government? Is there anything that we can do, the Canadian government, in order to put pressure on Israel? I mean, I know that historically, Canada is most certainly considered a friend of Israel. If that friend comes out very strongly, does that make a difference? Or do you believe that this solely rests within the sphere of American influence?
I don't think it solely rests in the sphere of American influence, but I would say that they're not equal. For better or worse, they're not equal.
I think everybody would agree with this.
But I would also argue that there's a cumulative effect here.
Right.
I would argue furthermore that the type of pressure matters. So in other words, you've got pressure from anti-Israel activists on the far left in both countries and in Europe, of course, who don't really make a lot of these distinctions between, liberal Zionists, far-right Zionists. I see this on Twitter all the time. To them, all Zionists are more or less the same, and all Israelis are more or less the same. And pressure from them is not going to be very productive. In fact, it might be counterproductive. But pressure from groups like Peace Now, whether we're dealing with a Canadian chapter, the American chapter, or the Israeli chapter, groups that are, Peace Now was founded by IDF soldiers in Israel. And so we're talking about the salt of the earth. We're talking about people who care and people who have the best intentions. We're not talking about bad faith efforts here, but who also want to redefine what it means to be pro-Israel. And I think that that's a broader conversation that all of us need to have in Canada and in the United States. Because if you only take what AIPAC says or those on the right, you get pro-Israel means you support whatever the Israeli government happens to do. And that's just not the case. In fact, so much of what the Israeli government has been doing in recent years, especially in the Netanyahu era, not only in the Netanyahu era, but especially in the Netanyahu era, has been antithetical to the values that I think liberal Zionists hold, to the kind of relationship that Canada and the United States want to have with Israel. And so I think that friendly pressure to explain why it is that you object to annexation, I think is very useful. And I think it has to happen now. We don't have a lot of time. The window it's a very small window. It's between now and November, or between now and January, you might say.
Mm-hmm. Do you expect any more very blatant proposals of policy shifts coming from the EU? There's certain threats have come out. We are going to do this. If you take this action, we're going to take this following action.
Yeah.
You expect anything like that to come out prior to July 1st?
Prior to July 1st, I really don't know. I don't know what they're planning. What I can tell you is that the Israeli press has reported that Israeli economists are very concerned about the economic ramifications of annexation, because they are convinced that if Netanyahu goes ahead with annexation, there will be serious sanctions imposed on Israel that will harm the Israeli economy. And you might keep in mind, this is the one thing, the Israeli economy, that Netanyahu can claim that he has been able to preserve, even despite so much of the economic turmoil we've seen from the stock market crash a number of years ago. He's been able to, and I don't think it's just Netanyahu, but they've been able to kind of stay afloat. Israel's economy will be damaged, and I think he's aware of those estimates.
Okay. Why don't we shift a little bit to annexation actually happening? Is it going to happen?
I don't know. As I said, there are two schools of thought.
Yep.
It's very difficult to read Netanyahu's mind. I did a study on Netanyahu, actually, and on his thought process when it comes to these issues: annexation, two-state solution, one-state solution. And this was a study that was published last year in Political Science Quarterly, PSQ. And I concluded that Netanyahu was never truly a supporter of the two-state solution. So that was clearly not an earnest speech on his part when he finally caved to Obama's demands and said the magic words. And he found many reasons, many excuses to not pursue the two-state solution. But he's also never been a supporter of the one-state solution. And he has both privately in private closed-door forums that were leaked, obviously, as well as publicly denounced the possibility that Israel would become a binational state, or any version of the one-state solution that would lead to Israel becoming a binational state. Now, of course, one could argue that his status quo orientation, and I would argue this, by the way, as well, isn't really status quo because we're dealing with creeping annexation. So even if he doesn't formally support annexation, his very policies will lead to de facto annexation, and and that could lead to a binational nightmare for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Do you think that Netanyahu actually supports the creeping annexation, or does he allow it because he has to?
I don't know if he sees it that way. I think he sees himself as the one figure in Israel who can manage the conflict. I don't think he trusts anybody else to do that job. And he sees himself as that one person who he thinks it's naive to speak in terms of resolving the conflict. And he's made enough off the cuff comments to that effect to lead me to believe that he doesn't really see that as an option. But I think he does believe that as long as he's prime minister and we don't see any signs of him stepping down, despite the indictments and despite everything else, even though he signed a coalition agreement with that rotation agreement with Gantz, we see no sign of him wanting to step down anytime soon. So as long as he's prime minister, he's the one, not Benny Gantz and not Gabi Ashkenazi and not anybody else. He's the one who's going to be leading the way. And so what we have is creeping annexation, whether he calls it that or not, and he doesn't refer to it as that. That's what we have.
So I have a couple questions from our audience that I'd like to inject here. So one question from Bob Cates, who is actually a member of our board, and another question from Martin Freeman regarding the opinions of Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. And that kind of centers around their ability to back out of this. Do you think that either of them have a way out? Maybe they went into it for different kinds of reasons. Do you see them, actually wanting to do that, and do they have a way out?
Here's what I can tell you. I mean, they've been extremely coy about their own positions on this. They haven't said a word. They've hardly said a word. What I can tell you is that they both are well aware of the dangers that I outlined earlier. They were both IDF chiefs of staff, former IDF chiefs of staff. Both of them, by the way, were able to stand up to Netanyahu when they were chiefs of staff because they rejected and stopped Netanyahu's initiative to bomb Iran militarily. And so we've seen that happen before. The question is, are they going to do that again in a political context? I can also tell you that the vast majority of former generals and senior security officials were dealing with, 85, 90%. The vast majority of them strongly oppose annexation, maybe even more than that. And they're among them. And the reason I say they're among them is not just because of comments and statements they had made before they joined the political arena, but they were both consultants to the INSS plan that came out in 2018, October 2018. Israel's #1 think tank, which is affiliated with Tel Aviv University, the INSS, came out with a plan that details the dangers of annexation. Okay, so they were behind it. And in fact, Gabi Ashkenazi was going around trying to promote it among politicians. I don't know whether or not they're going to be able to stop it because they don't have the same sort of political skills that Netanyahu has. I think they made a huge mistake, a huge blunder by joining Netanyahu in this coalition. It immediately split apart their party. They went into this thing having a very big party that rivaled Netanyahu's Likud. And now it's just a fraction of what it was before. So they've lost a lot of credibility politically. They reached a coalition agreement that doesn't even give them veto power over these annexation issues. So again, how are they going to get around this? So there are a lot of obstacles that that they're going to face if they're going to reject it.
Okay, thanks, Guy. I have two other questions that I want to kind of pull together here. One is from Ken Victor, and he asks, regardless of annexation, do you believe a viable two-state solution is still a possibility? Okay, and the second question from Ruth Steinberg is that if the left in Israel is moribund, what hope is there for a two-state solution supported by Israel?
So let me address the first question. The answer is yes, but time is running out. It's very popular these days to say, well, there's no hope for the two-state solution, it's dead. And people have been saying it's dead for decades, by the way. It's not a new argument, but the longer we wait, this may actually become a reality, unfortunately. I don't think it's too late. And I've interviewed many security officials who will basically say the same thing, which is it's all about the political will. If you are asking about whether or not physically, geographically, it's possible to have a two-state solution, absolutely the answer is yes. And Shaul Arieli has maps. David Makovsky in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy has an interactive map. He and Shaul Arieli, I'm sure, coordinated that will show you exactly how a two-state solution would work on the ground, which settlements would be able to be incorporated into Israel. I'm talking about big settlement blocks, which ones would have to be given up, how you'd have the land swaps, all these details that they show you nicely in maps. And there are other organizations that do similar things. You've got the Geneva Accords, you've got some of the generals that have formed the security organizations that they're part of. The Commanders for Israeli Security, for example, is one big one. So I think it is possible, but keep in mind that the Palestinians have lost hope. Most Israelis have lost hope. Abbas is not going to be around forever. And the one thing that I think Netanyahu, and not just Netanyahu, but Israeli leaders have really squandered over the years is this opportunity to negotiate a deal with somebody who may have a lot of weaknesses, for sure. But he is the one Palestinian leader who said he was against violence and has been very consistent, unlike Arafat and others. So it's a real shame, I think, and he's not going to be around forever. He's weak, he's old, he's in ill health, and there's going to be a succession. And I guarantee, and this is a prediction I am willing to make, that whoever succeeds him is going to be much tougher, much less reliable as a negotiating partner than Abbas would have been. So I do think time is running out, but I also don't think that it's too late.
I want to follow a kind of a series of logical conclusions through, and I want to know. I would like to know your opinion on this thought process. So, annexation happens, or we agree that the number of micro annexations have already taken place. It's too late to have a two-state solution. Full annexation occurs, and we end up with basically a single state solution. Some people would call that apartheid. And the world doesn't react very well to that. And we start to see sanctions, and the EU changes policies. Israel economy falls apart. The United States, maybe it's the Jewish community, the non-Jewish community, starts pushing the United States to push sanctions. Maybe that even happens. The EU has recently changed policy to indicate that they are in favor of equal rights, right? They've recently injected the equal rights statement into their statement regarding their interactions with Israel and Palestine. If that was to actually come about, if the two groups of people who are living within one country suddenly gain equal rights, the entire demographic nature of Israel changes, and the Jewish character could become a minority. Then this is no longer a Jewish state, and possibly in the future not even a democratic state. I don't know where you stand on that, but my question is, A, would you agree with that as a possibility? And if that is a possibility, why is that a calculation that the far right is not making?
Okay, so first of all, I agree with everything you said. I think that you laid it out very nicely, and there's nothing I disagree with. And the only thing is, I wouldn't say maybe apartheid. I would say it would be apartheid, because there are only two options here if annexation happens. Option A is equality, true equality, equal votes for everybody. That would mean that Israel ceases to be a Jewish state because of demographic realities.
Mhm.
Or option B is you don't give them citizenship, the Palestinians that you are now that are now in your state. You're not going to give them citizenship, and you have an apartheid situation. Neither of these scenarios is compatible with a Zionist dream. The Zionist dream would be dead, and the state of Israel, as we know it, would be a different state.
Mhm.
I would say that even in Israel, a lot of secular Israelis and liberals would leave. I mean, you would really see you would really see massive movement. This is not a kind of country that they would want to remain in. And certainly, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, I don't see American Jews behind this. The young generation, for sure not. And I think the young generation would also pressure their parents and grandparents to join them in this. So I just don't see a strong U.S.-Israel relationship continuing under that kind of scenario. But then again, Israel wouldn't be Israel if that happens. So I think that they would have very significant problems. But I do want to answer your question about what is the right saying on this? How is the right not seeing what
Right.
you and I are seeing?
Because that's supposed to be what they care about. They're supposed to
That's
care
right.
about it
That's
being
right.
a Jewish country.
Exactly. So what they're saying, so here you have, I'm going to simplify it, and because it is a little more nuanced and more complicated, but you have kind of two sets of opinions that you hear from the nationalist right, from the nationalist religious right, and most of them are religious. And I think that's a fair claim to make, that most of those pro-annexation people are religious. They're using religious justification for supporting it. These are not, for the most part, secular Israelis. They're religious Israelis. But here you have kind of two schools. One says you encourage Jewish immigration. You're going to have a lot of Jews who've been coming here from France, for example, because they've experienced more anti-Semitism. The UK has experienced quite a bit of anti-Semitism in recent years. We expect more Jews to be immigrating to Israel. That plus more babies on our end, that will more than balance things out demographically. So we're not worried, and it's not going to be apartheid. And we can even give the Palestinians rights because we're still going to be the majority. And then you have the more extreme school of thought, say people like Smotrich, who's now in the opposition, but he was a minister and he's one of the political leaders on the national religious right, who says, look, I'm not planning to give the Palestinians any voting rights. And if they want to stay, they can stay, but they have to respect us. And if they don't want to stay, they can leave. So though they would be, that kind of faction would be fine with apartheid. And they're not as concerned about international pressure. And they're certainly not as sensitive to international pressure as, say, Netanyahu is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I have another question here from Martin Freeman. And I just kind of want to talk through the nuances of this, which is that, so Israel annexes the West Bank, but legally or technically, there is still actually a Palestinian country that gets carved out here. Maybe it's not contiguous, maybe it's in all sorts of pieces, but it actually gets to be a country, and it represents the populated areas where the Palestinians live. Is this a backdoor attempt to not get labeled as having apartheid? What is this? I mean, how is Netanyahu framing this, and is anybody else in the world going to buy him?
Well, I mean, the last part of the question is easy. No, because it would be seen as illegal according to international law. And as I said, even a Biden administration is not going to recognize it. So all the other stuff, by the way, that happened earlier in the last several years that Palestinians were not happy about, such as recognizing Jerusalem and moving the embassy there, that's small potatoes. And by the way, I don't think Biden is going to, close the embassy in Jerusalem and move it back to Tel Aviv. I don't think that's going to happen. It's a done deal. But I think a decision to annex territories, that is going to change things dramatically. And you ask about the Palestinians, the best case scenario is that they would be able to have some sort of state that is less than ideal. But the worst case scenario is we're going to have an intifada, is that there's going to be chaos that breaks out, that the Palestinian Authority is going to collapse. And then you have radical elements that take over. It doesn't necessarily have to be organized. It can be organic and spontaneous, and forget security cooperation between Israeli and Palestinians that we've seen all these years that Israel has benefited from, quite frankly. So all of that will be gone, and that's a real concern. It's not just what are the Palestinians going to get here, what are they not going to get. It's what is the situation going to be there? It's going to be an absolute chaotic mess.
I mean, I'm really glad that you brought up the Palestinian position, because that, I mean, obviously there's two parties here, right? We focused a lot on the relationship between the United States and Israel, and we've recently had former and current Palestinian leaders come out and be a little more vocal around things that they're actually going to do. There's certain things that have been said, and there's certain things that have been implied. You've given us some examples of what you think may occur. How do you see any more proposed actions happening before July 1st by the Palestinians?
Not necessarily. I think you might see statements and more statements. Okay. I don't see any real. I think the PA is afraid, first of all, of what's going to happen internally, and there's a disconnect, quite a big disconnect between whatever Abbas says and his aides say and what the Palestinian thinking is on the ground. A lot of grassroots activists, a lot of young Palestinians feel that he's a stooge of Israel, that he doesn't represent them, that he's corrupt, that he has to go. And so he has very little, at this point, he has very little, very little clout. And I think he's limited as far as what he can do. And I think he knows that. So he's already threatened to stop security cooperation with Israel. He's done that. I think it's temporary because otherwise it would be chaotic, not just for Israel, but for him as well. Right. But I think he is just going to have to wait and see, like everybody else, what Netanyahu is going to decide. And ultimately, it really is up to Netanyahu.
Do you think that there is a political calculation by Netanyahu or his circle that is actually hoping that the Palestinian Authority collapses and that it all turns into chaos? In the sense that that would be an enemy that would be more easily opposed because of their actions or violence or anything like that?
I don't see that.
Okay.
Netanyahu is not a big risk taker, as I mentioned earlier. That would be way too big of a risk. What I would say is he's been very dismissive of Abbas and of the Palestinian Authority. And ironically, he's given much more respect and he's negotiated much more with Hamas over the years than he has with Abbas or the Palestinian Authority. So that I'm comfortable saying. But no, I don't think that Netanyahu would want to turn that situation into a complete, chaotic disaster. It's not, and I can't see anybody, by the way, wanting to see that happen.
Okay, fair enough. We have another question here from the audience regarding the establishment of a binational democratic state. Something like Belgium, or there are plenty of other countries that are set up in this manner. Can you see anybody actually going for this kind of setup?
No. If you ask young Palestinians, a lot of them say, forget the two-state solution. And I don't blame them because they haven't seen any result from any negotiation. Young Palestinians only know what they've seen since they've been alive, which is nothing, which is just more Israeli settlements and a hardline Israeli government that dismisses them. And so as far as they're concerned, let's wait it out and let's see what happens. And to the extent that they're promoting, I'm sorry?
Do you think they're making that same calculation that we discussed earlier, that ultimately it will result in their favor?
A lot of them, yes. A lot of them are biding their time and say we should bide our time. And those that actually have a strong opinion and kind of have a vision, let's just call it a vision, that's an alternative to the traditional paradigm of a two-state solution, is the idea of a one-state solution. But their idea of a one-state solution is very different than the one-state solution that is promoted by the Israeli right. Because when they're saying one-state solution, they're talking about a binational state that is not the state of Israel, that doesn't have Jewish symbols. It will be equality. And so they're going to have to come up with new symbols and new ways of doing things. That's definitely not what the religious right in Israel that supports a one-state solution envisions. So even though you might see when it comes to the two-state solution, some discrepancies here and there, what do you mean by a two-state solution? There's more or less a general consensus about what that means. Not so when it comes to the one-state solution. And no, I don't see it. I don't see it being viable at all. You've got two nations that really don't like each other, and they've proven that over many years, even before Israel was created. There were attempts in the 20s and 30s and 40s to have this kind of shared power, shared ideas. You know, this binational movement. A lot of Jewish intellectuals supported it, but it never went anywhere. They didn't have any takers, and at the end of the day, I think that self-determination is an overriding principle that I think that both nations share. They want to control their own destiny.
Okay, I think that's great. We are getting close to the end of our hour together. This has been an excellent conversation, covered a ton of ground. I'd like to give you kind of an opportunity to wrap us up tonight. One of the things we like to kind of do here with Peace Now is, if we can, you know, we don't want to be unrealistic, but if we can, we want to end on a hopeful note. So if I could ask you, what are the kind of things that you could say to our audience or any of the listening audience later when we publish this on YouTube around the things that we can do? What are the actions that an individual citizen can take? What are the actions that we could do to speak to government? Whatever that is there anything that you could leave us with tonight around moving forward?
Well, despite everything I said, I actually think that it's pretty easy to end on a hopeful note. And that's because of several factors. Number one, as I said, it is not inevitable. It is not inevitable that annexation is going to take place. And if you kind of read between the lines, even from Netanyahu's statements in the past few days to settlers and others, he's even having second thoughts. The Trump administration is having second thoughts. So I think the moral of the story here is that pressure really matters, and that your activists have, I would say, a moral obligation to, you know, it's much easier to tune out of everything. Basically, shut the computer, shut the phone down, and not read the news and not follow what's happening. But I would say we all have a moral obligation to speak out about something we know is harmful. This is a case where you've got a situation that's not a zero-sum game. It's harmful to everybody. It's harmful to Israelis, and it's harmful to Palestinians. This is something that human rights activists and Israeli security community shares. They might have different rationales for why they oppose annexation, but they share the same conclusion. And so I think it is very important to make that argument that being pro-Israel at this time also means strongly, vocally opposing annexation. Number two, you have a presidential election in the United States. And I'm not making predictions because I did that in 2016, and like most people, I was wrong. And so I told myself I'm never going to do that again. But I would say that Biden definitely has a shot at becoming president. And if he is president, I think we're going to see a very different American approach to a lot of issues, domestically too, of course. But as far as Israel is concerned, very different approach. And so I think there's a lot of room to be hopeful. And finally, despite my comments earlier about Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi making a monumental mistake by joining Netanyahu and his coalition, the fact is they're in this coalition right now. And the fact that you have some moderate elements in the coalition, at the end of the day, isn't such a bad thing. They too need to be pressured. And so I think that there is a way to also pressure the Israeli government from within that I think we haven't seen in the last few years because of the very hardline far-right governments that Netanyahu has led. He has a different coalition now. So I think that here I've given kind of three concrete, hopeful points that I think we can use to kind of wrap this up.
Fabulous. I mean, thank you, Guy. Thank you very much for making the time to come to speak with all of us. You've illuminated all of these issues for us. And I think you've provided a really good framework for all of us to understand the situation and take some really concrete action moving forward. I also want to thank our audience for attending today, listening to this conversation, asking some really excellent questions. Hopefully I've done my best to try to get to all of them, or as many as I could, and try to pull some of those together. I also want to give another opportunity here for our chairman, Gabriella Gallagher, to come in and say some closing words.
Thank you very much, Josh, for your great hosting, and particularly Guy for a very illuminating discussion. And I hope the audience did enjoy this. And we do have more webinars on the way, so do stay tuned. And I would like to just make a small appeal for your support. We need you very much, now more than ever. If you can make a donation to Canadian Friends of Peace Now, we'd really appreciate it. Just go to our website, and we have a donate button on the website. So please do that, or just send us an email. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you. Thank you for attending. I think, Josh, if there's anything else, or do you want to wrap it up now?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple things I'd also like to say. This conversation continues. This is one excellent conversation I think we had tonight, but this conversation is going to keep going. We're going to have future webinars, as Gabriella mentioned, and we're going to keep building on this momentum before July 1st. Please go online, follow Guy Ziv on Twitter, follow us on Twitter, join our Facebook group, go to peacenowcanada.org. Please, if you can, donate via that donate button. And also, I'd also like to just give an appeal out to all of our friends. You know, there's a lot of people who are from our sister organizations who are on this, who have representatives on this tonight. Canadian Friends of Peace Now is just one organization that is being very vocal about this topic. Israel is a country and a concept that matters to us very deeply, and we have a lot of friends here. So, you know, please go out and participate. If you volunteer, get out there, make your voice heard, and basically don't just stay silent. This is your opportunity to get out and speak. So with that, I'd like to just say a final thank you, Guy, and to thank you, all of you who have attended tonight, and I look forward to speaking with all of you in the future.
Goodbye.
Thank you.